The first time I saw the woman in the blue dress, she was running with the desperate urgency of one fleeing from mortal terror itself. It was not, I must admit, an entirely unusual sight to witness a lady running in Hyde Park on that crisp October afternoon. London society had embraced the modern cult of physical exercise with remarkable enthusiasm. Yet there was something in the manner of this particular woman's flight that struck me immediately as profoundly wrong. She was not running for health or recreation. She was running for her very life. She emerged from a narrow gravel path that wound between dense clusters of rhododendron and laurel, a shadowy ribbon I'd scarcely noticed before. The autumn light was already beginning to fade, casting long fingers of darkness across the park, and the fallen leaves beneath our feet were sodden from the morning's persistent drizzle. Against this backdrop of brown and grey melancholy, her dress stood out with startling vividness. A rich cornflower blue silk that would have been elegant in a drawing-room but appeared almost ethereal in the gathering dusk, though now muddied at the hem and torn at the sleeve. She stumbled as she reached the broader path, caught herself with a frantic movement that spoke of exhaustion, and cast a look over her shoulder that carried, even at our considerable distance, the unmistakable stamp of absolute terror. Then her eyes fell upon us, and her expression transformed entirely. Hercule Poirot and I had been engaged in what was, for my fastidious friend, a most unlikely occupation, a constitutional walk through the park. I had managed to coax him from his comfortable Whitehaven Mansions flat by appealing to his sense of order, suggesting that even the little grey cells might benefit from proper circulation of the blood. Poirot had sniffed disdainfully, declared that the brain should command the body, never vice versa, but had eventually consented, provided we kept strictly to the better-maintained paths and avoided any unnecessary contact with nature's less civilized aspects. Now, as the woman in the blue dress halted with sudden recognition, I observed that her face, pale beneath a fashionable hat adorned with a single trembling ostrich feather, bore the refined features of good breeding and education. Her lips were parted as she breathed in quick, shallow gasps, and there was an irregular dark stain along the fingers of her left glove that made my pulse quicken with foreboding. "Regardez, Hastings," murmured Poirot at my elbow, his green eyes already sharp with professional interest. "Voilà, an agitation most profound, and unless I am much mistaken, this lady knows precisely who we are." Indeed, before I could respond, the woman's gaze had fixed upon Poirot's unmistakable figure, his dark overcoat immaculate despite our walk, his silk muffler precisely arranged, his silver-topped walking stick catching what remained of the afternoon light. Something like recognition, followed immediately by desperate hope, flickered across her features. She seemed about to call out, then bit back the words with visible effort. With movements that appeared almost mechanical in their deliberation, she plunged her hand into her coat pocket and withdrew a small white envelope, sealed and unmarked. Without hesitation, she changed direction and approached us directly, her heels clicking urgently on the damp path. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice cultured but strained, carrying the faintest trace of an accent I could not immediately place. "Thank Providence, I had hoped. Please, you must take this. Say nothing now, not here, not yet." Poirot's eyebrows rose toward his meticulously groomed hairline as he accepted the envelope with characteristic delicacy, holding it between thumb and forefinger as though it might contain explosives. "Mais certainement, mademoiselle," he replied with grave courtesy. "I am indeed Hercule Poirot, but perhaps you would permit me to inquire—" "No." Her denial was sharp, almost fierce. She glanced back toward the shadowy path from which she had emerged, and I saw her hands tremble. "They are coming. You must not be seen speaking with me. Later, read it later, when you are alone." And with that extraordinary pronouncement she turned and fled once more, her blue dress flickering between the trees like some spectral apparition as she disappeared toward the Bayswater Road entrance. "Good heavens," I breathed, staring after her retreating figure. "What on earth was that about, Poirot?" My friend did not immediately reply. He stood perfectly still, his eyes narrowed in concentration, gazing not toward the direction of the woman's flight, but rather toward the dark path from which she had first appeared. His nostrils dilated slightly, as though detecting some scent carried on the evening air. "You observed, mon ami," he said at length, "the stain upon her glove?" "Blood," I said without hesitation. "At least, I believe so. Do you think there has been some sort of accident? An assault, perhaps?" Poirot made a small, almost impatient gesture with his free hand. "Always you leap to the melodrama, Hastings. Perhaps it is merely the juice of the blackberry, n'est-ce pas? But one does not run through Hyde Park in such a state of terror. One does not press mysterious envelopes upon detective consultants for the sake of stained fruit. Come, we shall make a small investigation along that path." We turned into the narrow walk from which the woman had emerged. The gravel wound between thick shrubbery that pressed close on either side, creating an enclosed, almost tunnel-like effect. The light seemed to diminish immediately, and there was a heavy, earthy smell of damp leaves and decay. A few paces along, Poirot halted abruptly and bent to examine the ground with his characteristic precision. "Voici," he said softly. Even my untrained eye could discern that someone had passed this way, in considerable haste. The gravel was disturbed, and the soft earth along the path's edge bore the clear impressions of small, high-heeled shoes. There was a deeper furrow where someone had stumbled, and beside it, unmistakably, several dark spots on the pale stones. I knelt for a closer look. "That is definitely blood," I said quietly. "Eh bien," said Poirot with satisfaction. "So we have blood after all. You see, Hastings, if one exercises patience, the melodrama, it presents itself quite naturally." We continued along the path. After perhaps 20 yards, it curved sharply to the left, and at this bend stood a small wooden bench, its surface dark with moisture. Upon it lay a pair of expensive grey suede gloves and a gentleman's walking stick with an ornate silver handle. And sprawled on the leaf-strewn ground beyond, face down among the wet foliage, was the motionless form of a man. I confess I gave a startled exclamation and started forward, but Poirot's hand shot out to arrest my movement. "Non, non, do not disturb anything, I beg of you," he said sharply. "Courage, mon ami, takes many forms. Sometimes restraint is the greatest bravery of all." We approached with extreme caution. The man appeared to be middle-aged and well-dressed, wearing a dark overcoat of excellent quality. His hat, a fine felt of the latest fashion, had rolled away and lay crowned down in a puddle. The back of his head, visible between his collar and silver-grey hair, had been crushed by a blow of tremendous force. A thin stream of blood had run from the wound to stain the autumn leaves beneath him. He was quite obviously dead. "Murder," I whispered, the words seeming to hang in the still air like a curse. Poirot knelt carefully beside the body, taking infinite care that his immaculate clothing should not touch the damp ground. He did not disturb the corpse, but examined it with intense concentration, his head tilting from side to side like an inquisitive bird. "A blow from behind," he observed quietly. "Delivered with considerable force. The walking stick, perhaps, though I observe it bears no visible stains. But such evidence can be arranged after the fact, can it not?" He rose, brushing an imaginary speck from his sleeve. "For once, my friend, we shall leave the scene exactly as Scotland Yard prefers to discover it." "Surely we must summon help?" I asked, though I knew the man was beyond any earthly assistance. "Assuredly. You will fetch a constable. There is usually one near the main gate. I shall remain here. The dead should not be left alone in the gathering darkness." As I hurried back along the path, my mind raced with the implications of what we had discovered. The woman in the blue dress, the blood-stained glove, the mysterious envelope, and now this unknown gentleman murdered in the shadowy depths of Hyde Park. We had stumbled, it seemed, from a peaceful afternoon's constitutional directly into the heart of a most sinister affair. When I, returned with a constable in tow. Poirot stood exactly as I had left him, a small, neat figure maintaining his silent vigil beside the dead man. The white envelope remained unopened in his hand. "You took some time, Hastings," he remarked mildly as the constable began his examination. "I've used the interval for reflection. This envelope. You are curious about its contents, are you not?" "Naturally," I replied. He smiled faintly, his eyes very green in the failing light. "As am I, mon ami. But there is the question of propriety. A lady in distress entrusts Hercule Poirot with a communication and requests that it be read later. She does not specify in the presence of the first policeman to arrive. We shall respect her wishes and examine it privately." "But Poirot," I protested, "if it contains information relevant to this crime—" "It will contain the same information in 1 hour's time," he replied placidly. "And by then, perhaps, we shall have the pleasure of meeting Inspector Japp or one of his colleagues." "Patience, Hastings. We have taken only the first step in what promises to be a most intriguing affair, the mystery of the woman in the blue dress who flees from murder." His eyes, bright with the unmistakable gleam of professional fascination, gazed once more toward the path down which our mysterious visitor had vanished. "Oui," murmured Hercule Poirot softly. "It has, without question, the most promising beginning." Inspector Japp arrived within the hour, his familiar figure striding along the darkening path with characteristic energy. His sharp eyes took in the scene with professional efficiency, though I detected the faint grimace that always appeared when he encountered Poirot at a crime scene. "Well, well," he said, removing his hat as he approached the body. "Trust you two to stumble across another corpse. Can't take a simple walk in the park without finding trouble, can you?" Poirot inclined his head with dignified politeness. "Bonsoir, Inspector. I regret that our constitutional has been interrupted by such unfortunate circumstances. The deceased, I fear, has been most inconsiderately murdered." Japp knelt beside the body, his examination swift but thorough. Within minutes, he had extracted a leather wallet from the victim's inner coat pocket and was studying its contents with growing interest. "Sir Reginald Ashworth," he announced, reading from a calling card. "Belgravia address, member of several exclusive clubs. Made his fortune in South African mining, if I'm not mistaken. Not the sort of gentleman one expects to find murdered in Hyde Park." The name meant nothing to me, but I observed Poirot's eyebrows rise with subtle interest. "Indeed, a gentleman of substance, then. And the cause of death?" "Blow to the back of the skull," Japp replied grimly. "Considerable force behind it. Probably killed instantly." He gestured toward the walking stick lying precisely arranged on the bench. "Might have been done with that, though there's no visible blood on it." Poirot approached the bench with his characteristic delicate steps, studying the walking stick without touching it. "Most interesting, Inspector. You observe the monogram upon the handle?" Japp peered closer. "CM," he read. "Not the victim's initials, then?" "Précisément. Either Sir Reginald was carrying another gentleman's stick, or our murderer has been careless enough to leave behind a most significant clue." Poirot's eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction, though I suspect the latter explanation may prove more complex than it initially appeared. As Japp continued his examination, organizing the removal of the body and the collection of evidence, I found my attention drawn repeatedly to the envelope still resting in Poirot's coat pocket. The mysterious woman's desperate plea echoed in my memory, and I wondered what secrets her message might contain. "Inspector," Poirot said suddenly, "if you have no immediate need of our presence, I believe Captain Hastings and I shall return to our lodgings. The evening grows cold, and there is a matter requiring my attention." Japp waved us away with characteristic brusqueness. "Off with you, then. I'll want statements tomorrow morning, mind. And Poirot, if that famous brain of yours comes up with any brilliant insights, you'll share them with Scotland Yard, won't you?" "Naturellement, my friend. You have my word." We made our way back through the park in contemplative silence, The gas lamps were being lit along the main paths, casting wavering circles of yellow light that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the gathering shadows. I found myself glancing frequently over my shoulder, remembering the terror in the blue-dressed woman's eyes as she had fled into the darkness. Back in the familiar comfort of Poirot's sitting room, my friend performed his evening ritual of removing his overcoat and arranging his person with meticulous care. Only when he was completely satisfied with his appearance did he produce the white envelope from his pocket. "Eh bien, Hastings," he said, selecting a silver letter opener from his desk. "The moment has arrived to discover what our mysterious lady wished to communicate." He opened the envelope with ceremonial precision and extracted a single sheet of cream-colored paper. His eyes moved across the elegant script with growing intensity, and I observed the familiar tightening around his eyes that indicated his brain was working at full capacity. "Mon Dieu," he murmured softly. "What is it, Poirot?" I demanded, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. He handed me the letter without comment. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, the words carefully formed, despite the obvious haste with which they had been written. "Mr. Poirot, I pray this reaches you safely. I am in terrible danger, and I fear others may be as well. What I have discovered about the Ashworth family must not die with me. The documents are hidden where only I can find them, but if something happens to me, look for the truth in the rose garden at Blackwood Manor. Trust no one connected to the mining consortium. They have killed before, and they will kill again. Time is running out." A friend who dares not sign her name. I looked up to find Poirot watching me intently. "Good heavens," I breathed. "She knew Sir Reginald was going to be murdered?" "More than that, mon ami," Poirot replied gravely. "She knows why he was murdered, and by whom. The question that now presents itself is whether we are already too late to save her life, or whether this letter represents her final gambit in a most dangerous game." He moved to the window, gazing out at the London night with the expression of a hunter who has caught the scent of his quarry. "Blackwood Manor," he mused. "The mining consortium. The Ashworth family secrets. We have been presented, Hastings, not merely with the murder, but with the opening moves of what promises to be a most complex and perilous investigation." He turned back to me, his green eyes bright with the unmistakable gleam of professional excitement. "Tomorrow we begin in earnest, but tonight we must consider that somewhere in London, a woman in a blue dress may be fighting for her very life." Sleep proved elusive that night, the woman's terrified face haunting my thoughts with persistent clarity. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw again that desperate flight through the shadowy paths of Hyde Park, heard the urgent whisper of her voice as she pressed the mysterious envelope into Poirot's hands. Between these visions danced the stark image of Sir Reginald Ashworth lying motionless among the autumn leaves, his life ended by a single, brutal blow. Poirot, characteristically, had retired at his customary hour, with an equanimity I could not begin to emulate. Before doing so, he had examined the letter once more with that peculiar intensity of his, then folded it carefully into a slim leather portfolio upon his desk. "Do not torment yourself, Hastings," he had advised with infuriating serenity. "The little grey cells require rest to function at their optimum capacity. Tomorrow we shall act with purpose. Tonight we preserve the machinery of the mind." Despite his counsel, dawn found me hollow-eyed and restless, my coffee growing cold as I stared unseeing at the morning papers. The headlines screamed of the Hyde Park horror in the sensational manner beloved by the press, but their lurid speculations seemed almost trivial compared to the genuine terror I had witnessed in that woman's eyes. Poirot emerged from his bedroom at precisely 8 o'clock, immaculate as always, his breakfast arranged with geometric precision. He had barely settled into his morning routine when Mrs. Hudson announced that Inspector Japp wished to speak with him urgently. At this hour, Poirot raised his eyebrows with mild surprise. The good inspector must have news of considerable importance to disturb the sacred ritual of breakfast. Japp entered with his characteristic energy, but his expression carried an unusual gravity that immediately commanded attention. Behind him followed a younger man whose expensive clothing and aristocratic bearing marked him as someone of considerable social standing, though his face bore lines of worry that seemed premature for his apparent age. "Poirot, Hastings," Japp nodded grimly. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Charles Ashworth, Sir Reginald's nephew and heir. He's brought us some rather disturbing information that may shed new light on yesterday's events." Charles Ashworth stepped forward, extending his hand with nervous courtesy. The family resemblance to the murdered man was unmistakable. The same refined features and silver-touched hair, though his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of recent shock. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, "I fear my uncle's death may be connected to matters far more complex than a simple robbery gone wrong. Last evening, after Inspector Japp informed me of the tragedy, I went to Uncle Reginald's house in Belgravia to begin the melancholy task of settling his affairs." Poirot leaned forward with subtle interest. "And you discovered something of significance, monsieur?" "His study had been completely ransacked," Ashworth replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Every drawer forced, papers scattered everywhere, his private safe blown open with what must have been professional skill. But that wasn't the most alarming discovery." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a sheet of expensive notepaper. "I found this pinned to his desk with a letter opener, driven so deeply into the wood that it took considerable effort to remove." Poirot accepted the paper with characteristic delicacy, his green eyes scanning the bold, aggressive handwriting. He read aloud, "The Ashworth family has kept their secrets long enough. Those who would expose the truth will share Sir Reginald's fate. This is your only warning." A profound silence followed this revelation. Inspector Japp was the first to speak, his voice heavy with implication. "Blackmail," he said grimly. "Someone was pressuring Sir Reginald, and when he refused to cooperate—" "Peut-être," Poirot murmured thoughtfully. "But observe, Inspector, if the murderer's goal was merely to silence Sir Reginald, why leave behind such a theatrical warning? Why draw attention to the very secrets they presumably wished to protect?" Charles Ashworth shifted uncomfortably. "There are matters in our family's past that certain people might find profitable to exploit. My uncle's business dealings, particularly in South Africa during the early days of his mining operations, were not always conducted with the scrupulous attention to local sensibilities that modern standards might require." "You speak of the mining consortium mentioned in our mysterious lady's letter," Poirot observed, with quiet satisfaction. "The connections begin to reveal themselves, do they not?" Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Hudson's voice called from the hallway that another visitor had arrived, claiming urgent business with Mr. Poirot. The door opened to admit a woman of perhaps 50 years, elegantly dressed in deep mourning attire, her steel-grey hair arranged in a severe chignon. Her dark eyes held a hardness that spoke of considerable experience with life's less pleasant realities. "Mr. Poirot," she announced with crisp authority, "I am Lady Margaret Ashworth, Sir Reginald's widow. I have come to engage your services in a matter that may well prove to be one of life and death." Charles Ashworth rose with obvious surprise. "Aunt Margaret, I had no idea you had returned from the continent." "I arrived on the overnight ferry from Calais," she replied, her voice controlled but underlaid with tremulous emotion. "Your uncle's death was not a random crime, Mr. Poirot. It was a calculated execution, and I believe I know why." She opened her handbag and withdrew a telegram form, its edges creased from handling. "This was delivered to our Paris hotel yesterday morning, 6 hours before Reginald was murdered. It reads, 'Your husband's sins have found him out. Bring the documents to London before sunset, or he dies.'" The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. Inspector Japp whistled softly under his breath. "They were holding him to ransom," he said. "But you were delayed." Lady Ashworth's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the grief beneath. "Fog at Calais. I didn't reach London until after midnight. By then, of course, it was far too late. Poirot rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the attitude of deep concentration I knew so well. "These documents," he said without turning, "they concern the mining consortium's activities in South Africa?" "Among other things," Lady Ashworth replied with grim precision. "My husband gave them to me for safekeeping years ago, with strict instructions that they were never to be revealed unless his life was in immediate danger." She lifted her chin with determined resolve. "I propose, Mr. Poirot, to use them as bait to trap my husband's murderer, but I shall require your expertise to ensure that justice is served rather than merely vengeance." Poirot turned back to face the room, his eyes very bright with professional interest. "You have, madame, presented us with a most intriguing proposition. But first, we must determine whether our mysterious woman in blue is still alive to benefit from such justice, or whether she too has fallen victim to those who would keep the Ashworth secrets buried forever." The morning light streaming through the windows seemed suddenly colder, charged with the promise of revelations yet to come. Lady Ashworth's composure remained unshakable as she regarded Poirot with the calculating gaze of one accustomed to navigating treacherous social waters. "The documents are not in my immediate possession, Mr. Poirot," she replied with measured precision. "They rest in the vault at Coutts Bank, where my husband placed them years ago, with explicit instructions that they were never to be disturbed except in circumstances of mortal peril." "And these circumstances," Poirot observed quietly, "have now presented themselves most dramatically." "Indeed they have." Lady Ashworth's voice carried the weight of grim determination. "The papers contain evidence of activities that could destroy not merely our family's reputation, but several other prominent households whose fortunes were built upon the same foundation." Charles Ashworth shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his aristocratic features betraying inner turmoil. "Aunt Margaret, surely you don't mean to suggest that Uncle Reginald was involved in anything genuinely criminal?" "My dear Charles," Lady Ashworth replied with glacial calm, "your uncle was many things, but naive was not among them. The consortium he helped establish in South Africa during the 1880s was not constructed upon charitable intentions." Inspector Japp leaned forward with professional interest. "What sort of consortium are we discussing, exactly?" Lady Ashworth's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Witwatersrand Mining Consortium. 4 gentlemen who acquired extensive mining rights through methods that would not bear close scrutiny by modern standards. My husband, Sir Lionel Blackwood of Blackwood Manor, Mr. Jasper Mallory of the financial firm Mallory and Associates, and Mr. Conrad Miles, the barrister who handled much of the legal framework." At the mention of the last name, Poirot's eyebrows rose with subtle satisfaction. "Miles," he repeated thoughtfully. "The initials CM, perhaps?" "Conrad Edward Miles, yes," Lady Ashworth confirmed. "Why do you ask?" I saw the connection immediately. "The walking stick in Hyde Park, Poirot, the one beside Sir Reginald's body, bore those very initials. Précisément, Hastings." Poirot's voice carried a note of quiet triumph. "Inspector Japp, I trust you have verified the ownership of that particular walking stick?" Japp nodded grimly. "We have indeed. Mr. Conrad Miles reported it missing yesterday evening, claiming he must have mislaid it during an afternoon walk in the park." "Curious timing, wouldn't you say?" "Most curious," Poirot agreed, "though we must not leap to conclusions. A walking stick may be lost, stolen, or deliberately placed to mislead. The psychology of the crime interests me more than the physical evidence." Charles Ashworth cleared his throat nervously. "I feel I should mention that Mr. Miles called upon me late yesterday evening, after the inspector had departed. He expressed his condolences naturally, but seemed rather anxious to know whether Uncle Reginald had left behind any sensitive documents." "Tiens," murmured Poirot with growing interest. "The web becomes more intricate by the moment." "And your response to Mr. Miles's inquiries?" "I told him truthfully that I had found nothing significant among my uncle's papers," Charles replied. This was before I discovered the ransacked study, of course. Lady Ashworth rose with sudden decision. "Gentlemen, I propose we take this investigation directly to its source. I intend to travel to Blackwood Manor this afternoon. There are arrangements to be made, and my husband always maintained that if trouble came, Blackwood Manor would be at the center of it." Poirot's eyes gleamed with professional anticipation. "An excellent suggestion, madame. With your permission, Captain Hastings and I shall accompany you. The mysterious lady's letter specifically mentioned the rose garden at Blackwood Manor, and I am most curious to discover what truth lies buried among the flowers." "And I'll follow by the evening train," Japp added decisively. "If this business is as dark as it appears, the yard needs a presence there." As our impromptu council of war began to disperse, Poirot moved to his desk and withdrew the anonymous letter once more, his finger tracing the elegant script with thoughtful precision. "Tell me, Lady Ashworth," he said without looking up, "among your late husband's associates, was there anyone who might have possessed both the knowledge to compose such a warning and the courage to risk their life delivering it?" Lady Ashworth paused at the door, her expression troubled. "There was his private secretary, Miss Evelyn Reed. She had access to all his correspondence and was remarkably devoted to him, but she was such a quiet, unassuming creature. I can hardly imagine her involving herself in anything so dramatic." "Ah," said Poirot softly, "but it is often the quiet ones who surprise us most completely. Inspector, if you would be so kind as to make inquiries regarding Miss Reed's current whereabouts." "Consider it done," Japp replied, already making notes in his ever-present notebook. As the door closed behind our visitors, I found myself studying Poirot's profile as he gazed once more at the mysterious letter. The familiar intensity was there, the slight narrowing of the eyes that indicated his remarkable brain was working at full capacity. "Well, Poirot," I said, "it seems we're bound for the country after all." He smiled faintly, folding the letter with characteristic precision. "Indeed, mon ami, and I suspect we shall find that Blackwood Manor holds more secrets than roses in its garden. The game, as they say, is afoot." The afternoon train to Surrey carried us through a landscape that seemed to mirror the darkening nature of our investigation. Lady Ashworth had secured a private compartment, and as the grimy outskirts of London gave way to rolling countryside, she began to speak with increasing candor about the shadows that had haunted her family for decades. "You must understand, Mr. Poirot," she said, her gaze fixed upon the autumn fields, beyond the window, that the Consortium was formed during a time when the moral complexities of colonial enterprise were viewed rather differently than they are today. My husband and his associates believed themselves to be bringing civilization and prosperity to a savage land. Poirot's response was characteristically diplomatic. "The perspective of history, madame, has a way of transforming heroes into villains and vice versa. What matters now is not the moral judgments of the past, but the present consequences of past actions." "Precisely," Lady Ashworth replied with grim satisfaction. She opened her handbag and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed with age. "This appeared in the Cape Town Herald 6 months ago. Perhaps you would care to read it, Mr. Poirot?" Poirot accepted the clipping with his characteristic delicacy and read aloud, "The Johannesburg Commercial Court has awarded damages of £2 million to the Cosa Mining Collective in their lawsuit against the estate of the late Sir Lionel Blackwood. The court found that the Witwatersrand Consortium systematically defrauded African mining partners of their rightful shares between 1884 and 1891. Similar suits against the remaining consortium members are expected to follow." The implications were staggering. I found myself calculating rapidly. £2 million represented a fortune that could bankrupt even the wealthiest families. "Good heavens," I breathed. "No wonder someone was desperate enough to commit murder." "Exactement," Poirot agreed. "But observe, Hastings. The lawsuit was against Sir Lionel Blackwood's estate, not against Sir Reginald Ashworth personally. Why, then, was Sir Reginald the target? Lady Ashworth's expression grew even more grave. Because my husband was the keeper of the Consortium's records. Every transaction, every forged document, every bribed official, he documented it all with meticulous care. He said it was insurance against betrayal by his partners. The train began to slow as we approached our destination. Through the window, I could see a small country station decorated with autumn flowers that seemed almost mockingly cheerful, given the dark nature of our conversation. Blackwood Manor revealed itself gradually as our hired carriage wound through the Surrey countryside. First came an imposing set of iron gates bearing an ancient family crest, then a long avenue of lime trees, their branches nearly bare in the October air. Finally, the house itself emerged from a grove of ancient oaks, a grey stone edifice of considerable age and austere grandeur, its mullioned windows like watchful eyes beneath a heavy slate roof. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair awaited us on the manor's stone steps. He bore himself with the quiet authority of one accustomed to managing great households, and his black frock coat was impeccably cut. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, my lady," he said, bowing slightly to Lady Ashworth. "I am Hargreaves, the butler. The household has been prepared for your arrival, and I must express our profound grief at Sir Reginald's passing." "Thank you, Hargreaves," Lady Ashworth replied. "This is Mr. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. They will be staying as my guests." As we were conducted through the broad entrance hall with its black and white marble floor and somber ancestral portraits, I felt the weight of the place pressing upon me. Polished wood, discreet wealth, and an underlying sense of secrets carefully preserved. In the drawing-room, a fire crackled cheerfully in a vast stone hearth, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the room's sole occupant. A young man in his late 20s rose to greet us, handsome in a careless, somewhat dissipated way. His dark hair was dishevelled, and his eyes, though red-rimmed with what might have been grief or sleeplessness, held an undercurrent of restless energy. "Aunt Margaret," he said, embracing Lady Ashworth with surprising tenderness, "I'm so terribly sorry about Uncle Reginald. It's just unthinkable." He turned to us, his gaze lingering on Poirot with curiosity. "You must be the famous detective. I'm Alistair Blackwood." Poirot inclined his head with grave courtesy. "My sympathies on your loss, monsieur. Tell me, was your late father involved in any particularly contentious dealings with Sir Reginald in recent years?" Before Alistair could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and a new voice, cool, precise, faintly amused, spoke from the doorway. "Ah, the great Hercule Poirot arrives at last. I confess I did not expect to encounter you at Blackwood Manor quite so soon." We turned to see a man of about 45 standing upon the threshold, impeccably dressed in a dark lounge suit, his fair hair silvered at the temples, his pale eyes sharp and calculating. He carried himself with easy confidence and bore an unmistakable air of practiced charm. "I am Conrad Miles," he announced, inclining his head with mock courtesy. "Barrister, family friend, and, as I understand from Inspector Japp's recent inquiries, a person of considerable interest to Scotland Yard." Poirot's eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction. "Très intéressant, Monsieur Miles. How convenient that you should arrive just as we begin our investigation into the Rose Garden secrets." Miles' composure flickered for just an instant, but it was enough. In that brief moment, I saw the face of a man who realized the game had changed, and that he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. Conrad Miles stepped fully into the drawing-room with the practiced confidence of a man thoroughly familiar with his surroundings, though I observed that his pale eyes never quite settled on any one person for more than a moment. He closed the door behind him with deliberate care, as though symbolically sealing our gathering from outside interference. "I trust I am not intruding," he said, his voice carrying that particular blend of charm and authority that marked the successful barrister. I received rather urgent communication this morning requesting my immediate presence at Blackwood Manor. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a yellow telegram form. Lady Ashworth, I came as quickly as the trains would allow. Lady Ashworth's eyebrows rose with unmistakable surprise. I sent no telegram, Mr. Miles. Indeed, I had no idea you were even aware of our presence here. The silence that followed this contradiction was profound and electric. Miles's composure flickered for just an instant, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that spoke volumes to anyone trained in the observation of human nature. Poirot, I noticed, was watching him with the intensity of a cat observing a particularly interesting mouse. How curious, Miles said at length, his voice carefully controlled. I have the telegram here, if you care to examine it. He extended the yellow form toward Lady Ashworth with a hand that remained perfectly steady. Perhaps there has been some confusion at the telegraph office. Poirot intercepted the telegram with characteristic delicacy, his green eyes scanning the message with meticulous attention. Most intriguing, he murmured. The message was indeed sent from London this morning, requesting your immediate presence here. However, I observe that it bears no signature, most unusual for a communication of such urgency. Telegraph clerks are notoriously careless about such details, Miles replied with studied casualness. I naturally assumed it came from Lady Ashworth, as she was the only person likely to summon me here on such short notice. Alistair Blackwood, who had been following this exchange with growing unease, suddenly straightened in his chair. I say, this is all rather peculiar, isn't it? Anonymous telegrams, mysterious letters. What exactly is happening here? Before anyone could respond, Hargreaves appeared in the doorway with his usual impeccable timing, though I detected an unusual tension in his normally composed demeanor. Begging your pardon, my lady, he said, setting down a silver tea service with ceremonial precision. But there has been a rather disturbing development in the grounds. The head gardener reports that someone has been digging in the rose garden during the night. The effect of this announcement was immediate and telling. Lady Ashworth went pale, while Miles's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, revealing a flash of what might have been panic or calculation. Digging? Lady Ashworth repeated faintly. In the rose garden. Précisément what we must investigate, Poirot declared, rising with sudden energy. Hargreaves, would you be so kind as to conduct us there immediately? The October afternoon was drawing toward its close as we made our way across the manor's extensive grounds. The rose garden lay beyond a formal parterre enclosed by ancient yew hedges that created an atmosphere of secluded intimacy. Even in the dormant season, the garden retained an air of cultivated beauty that spoke of generations of careful tending. But this tranquil scene had been violently disturbed. Near the garden's center, close to an ornate stone sundial bearing the Latin inscription Tempus omnia revelat, the earth had been torn up in several places. The excavations were not random. They formed a systematic pattern around the sundial's base, as though someone had been searching methodically for something buried beneath. Poirot knelt beside the largest disturbance, his practiced eye taking in every detail. The work was done with considerable skill, he observed. Note the clean edges, the careful replacement of turf. This was not the effort of casual vandals. Miles had followed us to the garden but remained standing at its edge, his face carefully neutral. Perhaps local troublemakers, he suggested without conviction. Country houses are often targeted by such miscreants. Peut-être, Poirot replied non-committally. He moved to examine the sundial itself, his fingers tracing the carved inscription with delicate precision. But observe, Hastings, the stonework here has been recently disturbed. The mortar is fresher, the alignment slightly irregular. Indeed, a section of the sundial's base showed clear evidence of having been opened and resealed. The implications were immediately clear. Something had been hidden here, and someone had retrieved it. My husband's insurance policy, Lady Ashworth said quietly, her voice heavy with understanding. He always said that if the worst happened, the truth would be found where time stands still. The sundial, Alistair breathed. Father was always fond of his cryptic references. Poirot straightened, his eyes bright with professional satisfaction. And now, mesdames et messieurs, we begin to see the pattern. Documents hidden, documents retrieved, and Sir Reginald murdered, all within the space of days. His gaze fixed upon Miles with uncomfortable intensity. Tell me, Monsieur Miles, when did you last visit Blackwood Manor before today? Miles hesitated for just a moment too long. I haven't been here for several months, not since Sir Lionel's funeral. Raymond? How curious, because the head gardener mentioned observing a gentleman matching your description examining this very sundial 3 days ago, the evening before Sir Reginald's murder. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Miles's face had gone ashen, and I saw his hands clench involuntarily at his sides. I think, Mr. Poirot, he said with desperate dignity, that you are making very dangerous assumptions based on remarkably little evidence. Au contraire, Poirot replied with quiet confidence, I am making logical deductions based on the most reliable evidence of all, human behavior. And human behavior, Monsieur Miles, is far more revealing than any physical clue. As if summoned by the mounting tension, the sound of approaching carriage wheels echoed from the direction of the manor house. Inspector Japp, it seemed, had arrived earlier than expected, and none too soon, given the increasingly volatile nature of our gathering in the rose garden, where time, indeed, was beginning to reveal all things. Inspector Japp's arrival brought with it the familiar blend of professional competence and barely contained impatience that I had come to associate with Scotland Yard's finest. He emerged from the gathering dusk with characteristic energy, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the disturbed earth around the sundial, the assembled faces, and the general atmosphere of barely controlled tension that seemed to permeate the rose garden. Well, Poirot, he said without preamble, removing his hat and surveying the scene with practiced efficiency, I can see you've wasted no time in stirring up the hornet's nest. What exactly have we discovered in this charming little garden? Poirot gestured toward the excavations with characteristic precision. The fruits of nocturnal labor, Inspector. Someone has been most industrious in retrieving what our late Sir Lionel Blackwood chose to hide beneath his philosophical sundial. Japp knelt beside the largest disturbance, his examination swift but thorough. Professional work, he observed grimly. Clean edges, systematic pattern, not the sort of thing you'd expect from casual grave robbers. He straightened, brushing soil from his hands. Any idea what they were after? Mais oui, Poirot replied, producing a muddy envelope from his coat pocket with ceremonial care. Observe, Inspector, the shell from which the pearl has been extracted. Japp examined the torn envelope, noting the initials WMC inscribed on the flap in faded ink. Witwatersrand Mining Consortium, he said with satisfaction. So the documents were here after all. Were being the operative phrase, Lady Ashworth observed with bitter precision. Someone has anticipated our investigation most effectively. As Japp continued his examination of the site, Poirot moved to inspect the base of the sundial itself, his magnifying glass catching the last rays of daylight. Within moments, he had discovered additional evidence that painted an even more disturbing picture. Regardez, Inspector, he called softly, indicating several small dark fragments scattered in the freshly turned earth. Our midnight visitor was not content merely to retrieve the documents. They attempted to destroy any trace of their existence. Japp peered at the burnt paper fragments with growing concern. Thorough, he admitted grudgingly, almost as if they knew exactly what they were looking for and how to eliminate any evidence of having found it. Conrad Miles, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke with carefully controlled tension. Inspector, I must protest this continued implication that I am somehow connected to these excavations. I have already explained that I received an anonymous telegram requesting my presence here. Yes, about that telegram, Japp replied, his tone deceptively casual. We've made some progress on identifying your mysterious correspondent. In fact, I have news that may interest all of you considerably. The silence that followed was profound, charged with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Even the evening breeze seemed to still as Japp consulted his ever-present notebook. We've identified the woman in the blue dress, he announced with characteristic directness. Miss Evelyn Reed, aged 28, formerly employed as Sir Reginald Ashworth's private secretary. She disappeared from her Bloomsbury lodgings 2 days ago, but not before making some rather interesting financial arrangements. Lady Ashworth went pale. Evelyn Reed. But she was such a quiet, dependable creature. I can hardly imagine her involving herself in anything so dramatic. Quiet ones often surprise us most completely, Poirot observed with quiet satisfaction. What manner of financial arrangements, Inspector? Japp flipped through his notebook pages. She closed her savings account yesterday morning, withdrew the entire balance from a branch of Barclays not 5 miles from here. The clerk remembered her particularly because she seemed extremely agitated and kept glancing over her shoulder as though expecting pursuit. The implications were immediately clear. Miss Reed had not only come to this area, but had liquidated her assets, suggesting either flight or preparation for an extended period of hiding. She knew the danger she was in, I said quietly. The letter she gave you, Poirot, it was essentially her last will and testament. Peut-être, Poirot replied thoughtfully. But consider this possibility, Hastings. What if Miss Reed's withdrawal of funds was not preparation for flight, but rather payment for services? What if she came here not as a victim, but as a participant in this elaborate deception? Alistair Blackwood, who had been following the conversation with growing bewilderment, suddenly straightened. I say, you don't mean to suggest that Uncle Reginald's own secretary was involved in his murder? I suggest nothing yet, Poirot replied with characteristic caution, but I observe that Miss Reed possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's affairs, access to his correspondence, and detailed understanding of the Consortium's secrets. Such knowledge, in the wrong hands, could prove most dangerous indeed. Japp closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Right then. We need to find Miss Reed, and we need to find her quickly. If she's still alive, she may be our key witness. If she's not... He left the sentence unfinished, but its implications hung heavy in the gathering darkness. Conrad Miles laughed bitterly. You speak as though finding one woman in the entire English countryside should present no difficulty whatsoever. She could be anywhere by now. Au contraire, Poirot said with quiet confidence. If Miss Reed is indeed our woman in blue, then she is not fleeing from this area. She's hiding within it. The question that remains is whether she is hiding from us or from the person who murdered Sir Reginald Ashworth. The church bell of the nearby village tolled the hour, its melancholy notes drifting across the grounds like a funeral dirge. As we turned back toward the manor house, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere in the surrounding darkness, Evelyn Reed was fighting for her life, or perhaps had already lost that battle. The game, as Poirot would say, was indeed afoot, but the stakes had just risen considerably higher than any of us had anticipated. The return journey to Blackwood Manor through the gathering darkness felt heavy with unspoken implications. Inspector Japp walked beside Poirot in contemplative silence, while Conrad Miles maintained his position slightly apart from our group, his pale eyes darting occasionally toward the shadows that pressed close around the gravel path. Lady Ashworth and Alistair followed behind, their hushed conversation punctuated by the young man's increasingly agitated gestures. As we approached the manor's imposing entrance, Hargreaves materialized with his customary efficiency, though I detected an unusual tension in his normally composed demeanor. The butler's trained eye swept over our mud-stained group with professional discretion before he addressed Lady Ashworth with careful formality. "My lady," he said, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled urgency. "I regret to inform you that there has been a development during your absence. A young woman arrived at the servants' entrance approximately an hour ago, claiming to be in distress and seeking temporary shelter." The effect of this announcement was electric. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with immediate interest, while Inspector Japp stepped forward with the alertness of a hunting hound catching a fresh scent. "A young woman?" Poirot inquired with deceptive mildness. "Did she provide identification?" "She gave her name as Miss Evans, sir, claiming to seek employment as a lady's maid. However—" Hargreaves paused with the discretion that marked the well-trained servant. "I took the liberty of observing her more closely, and I believe she may correspond to the description circulated by the local constabulary." Conrad Miles, who had been listening with growing tension, suddenly interjected. "Surely you don't propose to interrogate some unfortunate domestic without proper consideration of her rights? If this woman is indeed in distress—" "That," Inspector Japp replied with professional firmness, "is precisely what we intend to determine. Mr. Miles, I believe it would be advisable for you to remain in the drawing-room while we conduct our preliminary interview." The suggestion carried the unmistakable weight of official authority. Miles' carefully maintained composure flickered for just an instant, revealing something that might have been calculation or fear before he inclined his head with stiff courtesy. As we made our way through the manor's corridors, Poirot walked with a measured pace of deep contemplation. "Inspector," he said quietly, "the timing of this arrival strikes me as most significant. Consider, our mysterious lady flees from Hyde Park in terror, yet now she seeks refuge in the very place where the Consortium's secrets were hidden." "Coincidence?" Japp suggested, though his tone indicated skepticism. "Jamais," Poirot replied with conviction. "In my experience, coincidence is merely the universe's way of maintaining suspense. No, Miss Reed, for I am certain it is she, has come here for a specific purpose." We paused outside the housekeeper's sitting room, where a warm glow of lamplight spilled beneath the door. Before entering, Poirot turned to address our small group with characteristic precision. "What we discover in the next few minutes may well determine the course of this entire investigation," he said, his voice carrying unusual gravity. "I ask that you observe not merely what Miss Reed tells us, but how she tells it. The psychology of truth is often more revealing than the facts themselves. The woman who looked up as we entered was indeed our mysterious figure from Hyde Park, though the desperate terror in her eyes had been replaced by a weary resignation that was somehow even more disturbing. Her blue dress, now wrinkled and stained from her ordeal, hung loosely on her slight frame, and her dark hair had escaped its pins to frame a face marked by sleepless nights and constant fear. "Miss Reed," Poirot said gently, settling into a chair across from her with infinite care. "I am Hercule Poirot. You entrusted me with a letter in Hyde Park, n'est-ce pas? You spoke of documents hidden in the rose garden." She nodded slowly, her hands clutching a worn shawl around her shoulders. "I hoped you would understand the danger," she whispered. "I hoped you would know what to do with the truth." "And indeed I do," Poirot replied with reassuring confidence. "But first, you must help me understand something that puzzles the little grey cells considerably. The documents you spoke of. You claimed that only you knew their precise location, yet someone retrieved them with surgical precision, as though they possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Lionel's clever hiding place." Miss Reed's face went pale and her hands began to tremble. I thought I was the only one. Sir Reginald made me swear never to tell anyone about the Sundial's secret compartment." "Ah," Poirot murmured with satisfaction. "But secrets, mademoiselle, have a way of revealing themselves to those who know how to look. Tell me, in the days before Sir Reginald's death, did anyone show particular interest in the old documents? Anyone who might have pressed you for details about their safekeeping?" The silence that followed was profound and telling. Miss Reed's gaze darted toward the door, as though she expected someone to be listening beyond it. "There was someone," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Someone I trusted. Someone who said we could expose the truth together, bring justice to those who had been wronged. Inspector Japp leaned forward with professional intensity. Who, Miss Reed? Who betrayed your trust? Before she could answer, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond, followed by the sharp crack of a door slamming shut. Somewhere in the depth of Blackwood Manor, a man's voice called out in urgent alarm. The game, it seemed, had taken yet another dangerous turn. The urgent voice belonged to Alistair Blackwood, and his cry of alarm sent Inspector Japp bolting from the housekeeper's sitting room with characteristic energy. The young man stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his face drained of colour, pointing toward the main corridor with a trembling hand. "It's Miles," he exclaimed breathlessly. He heard Miss Reed's voice through the door and went absolutely white. When Hargreaves mentioned she was here seeking shelter, he muttered something about the game being up and bolted toward the rear of the house. Before anyone could respond, the distant crash of breaking glass echoed from the direction of the library, followed by the unmistakable sound of a window being forced open. Inspector Japp was already moving, his heavy footsteps thundering down the corridor as he pursued the fleeing barrister. Poirot rose with more measured deliberation, but I could see the satisfaction gleaming in his green eyes. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured as we followed in Japp's wake, "how guilt reveals itself through action rather than words. Monsieur Miles has just provided us with the most eloquent confession possible. We found the library in chaos, books scattered across the Persian carpet, a display case shattered, and the tall windows standing wide open to the October night. Beyond them, we could hear Japp's voice raised in pursuit, punctuated by the sharp blast of a police whistle summoning the constables stationed around the grounds. The theatrical nature of this flight interests me greatly," Poirot observed, examining the broken glass with characteristic precision. "A man of Miles's intelligence does not panic without excellent reason. He knows that Miss Reed possesses information that will destroy him utterly." Within minutes, the sounds of pursuit had ceased, replaced by Japp's triumphant voice calling from the rose garden. "Got him!" The fool tried to hide behind the sundial. Rather poetic justice, wouldn't you say? When we returned to the housekeeper's sitting room, we found Miss Reed exactly as we had left her, though her hands now shook so violently that Lady Ashworth had taken the precaution of relieving her of her teacup. The young woman's eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and relief. "He's caught," she whispered. "Conrad is caught." "Indeed, mademoiselle," Poirot replied gently, settling back into his chair with infinite care. "His flight has provided us with most compelling evidence of guilt. But now, if you would be so kind, perhaps you could complete what you were about to tell us." Miss Reed drew a shuddering breath, her composure finally cracking under the weight of her terrible knowledge. "It was Conrad Miles who convinced me to betray Sir Reginald's trust," she said, her voice barely audible. "He spoke so persuasively about moral duty, about bringing justice to those who had been wronged by the Consortium's actions in South Africa." Lady Ashworth's hand tightened protectively on the young woman's shoulder. "He used your conscience against you." "Precisely," Miss Reed continued with growing strength. "At first, I believed we were partners in exposing the truth. I told him about the documents hidden at Blackwood Manor, about the Sundial's secret compartment. But once he had that information, everything changed. He became cold, calculating. Instead of going to the newspapers, he began demanding money from Sir Reginald. Large sums, paid through intermediaries. Inspector Japp, who had returned muddy but triumphant from the capture, leaned forward with professional interest. Blackmail, then. How long had this been going on? 3 months, Miss Reed replied miserably. When I confronted Conrad about it, he laughed, said I was in it as deeply as he was now, that no one would believe I hadn't been his willing accomplice from the beginning. Poirot's eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity that indicated his remarkable brain was working at full capacity. And the night of the murder, mademoiselle, you followed Sir Reginald to Hyde Park. I had to warn him, she said desperately. Sir Reginald had discovered that someone had betrayed the secret of the Sundial's location. He suspected me, naturally, but I think in his heart he knew the truth. That evening, he told me he was going to meet Conrad in the park, to end this shameful business once and for all. The silence that followed was profound. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as though the very room was holding its breath. "You witnessed the murder?" Poirot said quietly. It was not a question. Miss Reed nodded, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. I followed at a distance, hoping to intervene to prevent violence. But I was too late. I saw Conrad strike Sir Reginald from behind with his own walking stick, a single, terrible blow. Then he arranged the scene, placing his own walking stick nearby to suggest he had been the victim of robbery. "Why did you not go immediately to the police?" Inspector Japp asked, though his tone was gentle rather than accusatory. "Because I knew Conrad would claim I was his accomplice," she replied with bitter understanding. "Who would believe the word of a secretary against that of a respected barrister? I needed proof, evidence that would expose the truth beyond question." Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkness where Conrad Miles now sat under guard, his carefully constructed facade finally stripped away. "And so, mademoiselle," he said softly, "you chose to entrust that proof to Hercule Poirot, hoping that the little grey cells might succeed where the official channels would fail." "I had heard of your reputation for seeing through deception," she whispered. "I prayed you would understand the danger, that you would know what to do with the truth." As if summoned by the weight of revelation, Hargreaves appeared in the doorway to announce that Inspector Japp's colleagues from Scotland Yard had arrived to transport the prisoner. The net was closing around Conrad Miles, and justice, it seemed, would finally be served. But I could see in Poirot's expression that something still troubled him, some final piece of the puzzle that had yet to fall into place. The satisfaction that settled over Blackwood Manor following Conrad Miles's capture proved to be as fleeting as morning mist. Inspector Japp, flushed with the triumph of swift justice, supervised the barrister's removal with characteristic efficiency, while the assembled household breathed collective sighs of relief. Yet I observed that Poirot remained curiously unmoved by these developments, his green eyes retaining that particular intensity that indicated unfinished business. "Well, Poirot," Japp declared with evident satisfaction as the police van disappeared down the darkened drive. "Another case closed in record time. Miles's flight was as good as a confession. Caught him trying to hide behind the very sundial where he'd retrieved the documents. Rather poetic justice, wouldn't you say?" Poirot's response was characteristically measured. "Justice, Inspector, requires truth as well as poetry, and truth, I fear, may prove more elusive than our theatrical barrister's dramatic flight would suggest." Miss Reed, still pale but visibly relieved, sat quietly beside Lady Ashworth, who had taken the young woman under her protective wing. Alistair Blackwood stood near the fireplace, his aristocratic features reflecting what appeared to be genuine shock at his family's barrister's betrayal. "Surely you don't doubt Miles's guilt?" Alistair asked, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment. "Miss Reed witnessed the murder herself. His own walking stick was found at the scene. When confronted with the evidence, he fled like a guilty man." "Précisément," Poirot replied, settling into his chair with characteristic precision. "He fled like a guilty man. But guilty of what, exactly? That, mes amis, is the question that continues to perplex the little grey cells." He leaned forward, his fingers steepled in the familiar gesture of deep concentration. "Consider the sequence of events, if you please. Miles blackmails Sir Reginald, using information obtained through Miss Reed's betrayal of trust. When Sir Reginald threatens to expose the scheme, Miles murders him in Hyde Park. Then, inexplicably, he leaves his own walking stick at the scene, a clue so obvious that even Scotland Yard could not miss its significance. Inspector Japp frowned. "What are you suggesting, Poirot?" "I suggest nothing yet," I merely observe that the psychology of this crime contains certain irregularities. A man clever enough to orchestrate months of successful blackmail does not suddenly become so careless as to leave such damning evidence at a murder scene. Poirot rose and moved to examine the Consortium photograph on the mantelpiece, his eyes studying each face with renewed intensity. And then there is the matter of timing. Miles received an anonymous telegram summoning him here precisely when Miss Reed arrived, seeking shelter. Coincidence, Inspector, or careful orchestration? The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Miss Reed shifted nervously in her chair, while Lady Ashworth's expression grew increasingly troubled. Furthermore, Poirot continued, his voice taking on that particular cadence that indicated approaching revelation, we must consider the curious nature of Miss Reed's letter. She wrote of documents hidden in the rose garden, yet those same documents were retrieved by someone with intimate knowledge of their location, someone who knew not merely that they existed, but precisely where Sir Lionel had concealed them. He turned to face Miss Reed directly, his gaze penetrating but not unkind. Tell me, mademoiselle, in your years of service to Sir Reginald, did he ever speak of visiting Blackwood Manor? Did he perhaps mention the Sundial's significance or his late partner's fondness for cryptic hiding places? Miss Reed's composure began to crack under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning. He mentioned it once. Said Sir Lionel had always been fond of riddles and secret compartments. Ah, Poirot murmured with satisfaction. And you shared this knowledge with Miles during your collaboration? I thought it might be useful for our investigation, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Investigation, mademoiselle, or exploitation? Poirot's tone remained gentle, but his words carried unmistakable weight. You see, Inspector, I begin to suspect that our Miss Reed's role in this affair may be more complex than her testimony initially suggested. Before anyone could respond, Hargreaves appeared in the doorway with his customary discretion. Begging your pardon, sir, but there's been a telephone call from London. The gentleman insisted it was most urgent. Poirot accepted the message with characteristic precision. As he read, his eyebrows rose with unmistakable interest. Très intéressant, he murmured. It appears, Inspector, that our investigation has taken yet another fascinating turn. The South African plaintiff's solicitors have received an anonymous package containing copies of the Consortium documents, posted from London yesterday morning, several hours before Sir Reginald's murder. The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. If the documents had already been sent to the plaintiffs, then Miles's supposed motive for murder, preventing their exposure, became meaningless. Someone, Poirot observed with quiet satisfaction, has been playing a very deep game indeed, and I suspect that tomorrow's revelations will prove even more illuminating than tonight's dramatic capture. The woman in the blue dress sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, but I noticed that her knuckles had gone white with tension. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The morning light filtering through Blackwood Manor's mullioned windows cast long shadows across the drawing room as Hercule Poirot arranged the final pieces of his investigation. Inspector Japp had returned from London with additional evidence, while the assembled household waited with the tense expectation that accompanies the approach of truth. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice carrying the ceremonial gravity that marked his most significant revelations. We have been witnesses to a crime of considerable complexity, one that required not merely opportunity, but intimate knowledge of family secrets and a willingness to sacrifice everything for the preservation of reputation. Conrad Miles sat under guard near the door, his earlier confidence replaced by wary calculation. Miss Reed occupied her place beside Lady Ashworth, her pale features marked by exhaustion and lingering fear. Alistair Blackwood stood near the mantelpiece, his aristocratic composure intact, but his eyes betraying an underlying tension that had grown more pronounced with each passing hour. The apparent solution, Poirot continued with methodical precision, presents itself with compelling simplicity. Conrad Miles blackmails Sir Reginald Ashworth using information obtained through Miss Reed's betrayal of trust. When exposure threatens, Miles murders his victim in Hyde Park, leaving behind his own walking stick in a moment of panic. His subsequent flight, when confronted with Miss Reed's testimony, provides the final confirmation of guilt. He paused, allowing the familiar narrative to settle before continuing. Yet the little grey cells, they are troubled by certain irregularities. First, we have the curious matter of timing. The Consortium documents were dispatched to the South African plaintiffs hours before Sir Reginald's murder, eliminating Miles's primary motive for violence. Second, we have the question of method. Why would so calculating a blackmailer leave his own walking stick at the scene of his crime? Inspector Japp frowned with professional skepticism. Panic, perhaps. Even clever men make mistakes under pressure. Peut-être, Poirot acknowledged. But consider the third irregularity, the anonymous telegram that summoned Miles to Blackwood Manor at precisely the moment when Miss Reed arrived, seeking shelter. Such timing suggests not coincidence, but careful orchestration by someone with intimate knowledge of all parties involved. He moved to examine the Consortium photograph on the mantelpiece, his fingers tracing the carved frame with characteristic delicacy. The truth, I believe, lies not in the apparent evidence, but in the psychology of fear. Each person in this affair feared something different. Miles feared exposure of his blackmail scheme. Miss Reed feared the consequences of her betrayal. Sir Reginald feared the resurrection of old sins. But there was another fear, mes amis, one that proved more dangerous than all the others combined. Poirot's gaze settled upon Alistair Blackwood with uncomfortable intensity. The fear of losing everything one's family had built, regardless of how that foundation was constructed. Alistair's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Mr. Poirot." "Vraiment? Then perhaps you would explain the mud on your grey overcoat, the one Hargreaves mentioned finding in the cloakroom yesterday morning. Mud that matches precisely the soil disturbed around the sundial in the rose garden." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Lady Ashworth's face had gone pale, while Miss Reed watched with growing comprehension. "Furthermore," Poirot continued relentlessly, "there is the matter of footprints. In Hyde Park, I observed 2 sets of elegant shoe prints approaching the body, one belonging to Miss Reed, the other bearing the distinctive wear pattern of your own boots, Monsieur Alistair. The same boots that left traces in the rose garden soil." Alistair's aristocratic features had tightened with barely controlled tension. Circumstantial evidence at best. Many gentlemen wear similar footwear. Certainment. But how many gentlemen possess the intimate knowledge necessary to locate Sir Lionel's secret compartment in the sundial? How many could move freely about Blackwood Manor's grounds without arousing suspicion? And how many had access to the family telegraph account used to send that anonymous summons to Miles? Inspector Japp was leaning forward now, his professional instincts fully engaged. "Are you saying young Blackwood orchestrated the entire affair?" "I am saying," Poirot replied with quiet satisfaction, "that Alistair Blackwood recognized the approaching crisis before anyone else. When Miss Reed began copying documents for Miles's blackmail scheme, when the South African lawsuit threatened to expose the Consortium's crimes, when Sir Reginald grew increasingly desperate to contain the damage, Alistair saw that the family's carefully constructed respectability was about to crumble entirely." He turned to face Alistair directly. "So you devised an elegant solution. You would retrieve the original documents from their hiding place, eliminating the physical evidence of your father's crimes. You would arrange for Sir Reginald's death in circumstances that would implicate Miles completely, and you would use Miss Reed's genuine terror and moral outrage to provide unimpeachable testimony against your chosen scapegoat." Alistair's hands had clenched involuntarily at his sides. "This is pure speculation. You have no proof of any of this." "Au contraire," Poirot replied calmly. The proof lies in the psychology of the crime itself. Consider the sequence of events. Sir Reginald meets Miles in Hyde Park for what both men believe will be a final confrontation. But you are there as well, hidden among the trees, waiting for the moment when violence becomes inevitable. His voice took on the hypnotic cadence of absolute certainty. When Sir Reginald turns away from Miles in disgust, perhaps threatening to expose the blackmail scheme to the authorities, you strike him from behind with his own walking stick. The angle of the wound, incidentally, is consistent with someone of your height delivering a blow from the left side. You are left-handed, n'est-ce pas? The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Alistair's face had gone ashen, but his voice remained steady. Even if what you suggest were true, why would I leave Miles' walking stick at the scene? Because you did not leave Miles's walking stick, Poirot replied with quiet triumph. You left Sir Reginald's stick, the one with which you struck the fatal blow. Miles's stick, bearing his monogrammed initials, you took with you, knowing it would eventually be discovered in his possession and provide additional evidence of his guilt. The logic was inexorable, and I saw understanding dawn in Inspector Japp's eyes. So, when we found Miles's stick at his lodgings, it wasn't because he'd forgotten to dispose of it. It was because he'd never had it in the first place. Précisément. Miles fled from Blackwood Manor not because he feared exposure for murder, but because he finally understood that he had been systematically framed for a crime he did not commit. Lady Ashworth had risen, her face a mask of horrified comprehension. "Alistair," she whispered, "tell me this isn't true." For a long moment the young man stood frozen, his aristocratic composure warring with the weight of exposure. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice carrying the hollow tone of utter exhaustion. "The lawsuit would have destroyed us. Not just the money, though that would have been catastrophic enough, but the scandal, the disgrace. Everything my father built, everything our family represented, would have been reduced to ashes in the newspapers." "So you chose murder," Inspector Japp said grimly. "I chose survival," Alistair replied with desperate dignity. "I thought, when I struck Uncle Reginald, I thought I was only stunning him, buying time to reason with him. I never intended, but when I saw he was dead, I knew I had to protect what remained of our name." Miss Reed had begun to weep quietly, the full horror of her unwitting participation finally clear. "I helped you," she whispered. "My testimony, my letter to Mr. Poirot. I helped you frame an innocent man." "Miles was hardly innocent," Alistair said bitterly. "He was a blackmailer and a parasite. If he hanged for Uncle Reginald's murder, at least some justice would have been served." "Justice?" Lady Ashworth's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You speak of justice while describing the cold-blooded murder of your own uncle." Before Alistair could respond, Inspector Japp stepped forward with professional authority. "Alistair Blackwood, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Reginald Ashworth. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Alistair looked once more around the drawing room that had been his family's sanctuary for generations. "I did it for Blackwood Manor," he said quietly, "for everything it represented." "What it represented," Lady Ashworth replied with cold finality, "was built upon lies and exploitation. Perhaps it is time for that particular legacy to end." The afternoon shadows were lengthening as the police van carried Alistair Blackwood away from his ancestral home. In the drawing room, an unusual quiet had settled over the remaining occupants. Miss Reed sat exhausted but relieved, her ordeal finally at an end. Lady Ashworth stood by the window, contemplating a future that would require the complete reconstruction of her family's identity. "Tell me, Poirot," I said as we prepared to depart, "when did you first suspect that Alistair was our true culprit?" The moment he expressed surprise at Miles's presence here, Poirot replied, adjusting his gloves with characteristic precision. For if Miles had truly sent himself that anonymous telegram, why would he then express bewilderment at finding us assembled? No, the telegram was sent by someone who wished to gather all the players for a final act. Someone who understood that Miles's presence would provide the perfect climax to an elaborate frame. As our train pulled away from the Surrey countryside, I reflected on the tragic irony of the case. In attempting to preserve his family's reputation, Alistair Blackwood had ensured its complete destruction. The Consortium's crimes would be exposed, the lawsuit would proceed, and the Blackwood name would be forever associated with murder rather than mere historical malfeasance. "The psychology of guilt," Poirot observed, watching the darkening landscape through the carriage window, "is perhaps the most reliable evidence of all. A man may disguise his actions, alter physical evidence, and construct elaborate alibis. But when confronted with the truth, the guilty conscience reveals itself through flight, through panic, through the desperate measures of one who knows his deception has been discovered." He smiled with quiet satisfaction. The woman in the blue dress sought justice for historical wrongs. In the end, she achieved something far more profound. She exposed the continuing corruption that would have allowed those wrongs to remain forever hidden. The case was closed, but its implications would resonate far beyond the walls of Blackwood Manor. Sometimes, I reflected, the pursuit of truth demands the destruction of comfortable lies, regardless of the cost to those who have built their lives upon false foundations. As Poirot would say, order must ultimately triumph over deception, and in this particular affair, order had indeed been restored, though at a price that would haunt the survivors for years to come.